everybody. We're here with Leaderboard. My name is Evan. I'm the Director of Sourcing at Passenger Coffee, and I'm here with Russ, who is our head roaster. We're really excited to be sort of in the mix with this season of Leaderboard. And today we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking to you about body and mouthfeel when tasting coffees, and kind of go over a few tips that might be helpful as you're tasting mystery coffees and trying to figure out what they might be. So I guess the appropriate place to start is to say, what actually is body and mouthfeel? What do we actually mean in the coffee industry when we're tasting coffee and we're thinking about body and mouthfeel?
Yeah, I think the sort of general way we speak about body is as kind of a tactile descriptor that will communicate the sort of the way coffee feels in your mouth, and like the weight of the coffee maybe on your tongue or just around on your palate. It's also sometimes interchangeable with mouthfeel, but mouthfeel maybe sort of involves a little bit more, including acidity, arguably aftertaste, but yeah,
that's definitely like my understanding of it as well. I think maybe people use the terms in different ways in different contexts, but generally speaking, I feel like we think of it as mouthfeel being a little broader,
right?
Including body, but also maybe some other things that sort of influence that tactile sensation that you have. But I'm curious, especially for you, being a coffee roaster, like, do you have a sense for, like, in terms of chemistry, what's going on at all in terms of, like, what makes certain coffees seem to have a different weight in your mouth?
Right, yeah. I'm certainly not a chemist. But I think one thing that we have noticed through cuppings of various coffees is that, African coffees just tend to end up post-roast with higher solubility, excuse me. And so I think some of the insoluble compounds in coffees that I think those are contributable to body. So, just some like coffee fibers and oils. And so I think there's some correlation there that generally in the Central South American coffees that exhibit lower solubility when we're TDSing them, tend to have more body because there's more of those insoluble components to them. But that's, about as maybe as deep as my chemistry knowledge goes, but I do think that.
No, I think that's absolutely right, and I think that definitely comes into play. That one of the things, I mean, obviously, as with anything, we all taste in slightly different ways, and we all bring maybe a slightly different palate to tasting coffee. But when we have differing levels of perceived body, if one coffee feels a little heavier on the palate compared to a coffee that feels lighter, I definitely think that one of the things that's going on is we're detecting a little more or a little less in the way of insolubles, like you say, proteins, kind of lipids, coffee oils for sure, and that definitely has an impact. And I feel like the other thing that makes me think about that is also maybe a way of illustrating body and how we experience it when we're tasting coffee. It makes me think about brewing coffee and different brewing methods, especially different types of manual brew methods. So I feel like a really classic example would be thinking about brewing coffee in a French press as opposed to brewing coffee in some type of a filter setup like a pour over that uses a paper filter. So for anyone who's used a French press before, the filter on the French press, which is a part of the plunger, is a relatively coarse mesh metal filter. And that type of filter allows a lot of those coffee oils that we were talking about to actually result and pass through into the finished cup of coffee. So generally speaking, if you're enjoying a nice cup of French press coffee, it tends to be, relatively speaking, fairly heavier bodied compared to a filter coffee, where if you're making a Hario V60 or something, you're pouring through a paper filter that is going to filter out a lot of those coffee oils, a lot of those insolubles. And so for that reason, I think pour over coffees often have really great clarity and also, relatively speaking, or comparatively speaking, a little bit of a lighter body. Yeah. Both can be super enjoyable, but I think that illustrates like part of what's going on in the differences in body that we sort of perceive when we're tasting coffee. So yeah, I feel like maybe a next step is to just talk about like some really broad categories that we could organize these different types of body or mouthfeel that we're perceiving when we're tasting coffee. How would you break it down, especially for someone that's, I mean, we have a lot of different viewers. I think some are seasoned coffee tasters, but also for someone that's a little bit newer to tasting coffee, like how would you break it down?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like there's sort of main categories and then sort of these offshoot subcategories you could have. Right. But I think, you know, if you're starting sort of on the lower end of the spectrum, like a light bodied, it can be sort of run on the spectrum from maybe like less desirable up to more desirable qualities. It can be light to the point where it's almost a little watery.
Or a little thin.
A little thin, yes. Like just kind of kind of flat,
almost not enough there.
Not expressive at all.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you get to the more generally desirable body in that like lighter territory where you're getting something tea-like that's really pleasant, or just something really juicy. So yeah, that's your sort of lighter end of the spectrum. Medium body, you are sort of thinking more like round and creamy, maybe a little bit starting to get syrupy. And then heavier body, again, sort of like can present in more and less desirable ways. Sometimes it's like, just feels very full, like sort of coats your whole palate, sort of like expansive body. And then it can also just sometimes be really like pretty chewy. Yeah. We say chewy sometimes. So yeah, I feel like light, medium, heavy is sort of like a good top category, and then there's like sort of subcategories below that. But
yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of those words obviously refer to other beverages, or other sensations tactile sensations that we would associate with eating other things or drinking other beverages. So to some extent, something like creamy or juicy is relatively self-explanatory. But I think another reference point that is definitely like helpful, and I feel like tends to be a fixture of like every barista 101 training session, is kind of using different types of dairy as a reference point for different kind of intensities of body that you can experience in coffee. So a great example as a reference point for a light-bodied coffee would be something like skim milk. So once again, like fairly thin, not a ton of weight when you're drinking a glass of skim milk. I don't know when the last time I actually drank a glass of that is. I'm not sure that that's actually what I would prioritize. Right. But, if you enjoy skim milk, power to you. You're going to have a really good reference point for a sort of lighter bodied coffee. Moving down kind of the progression, medium body, I feel like often compared to the increased weight that your palate detects if you move from skim milk to whole milk. So a little creamier, a little rounder, a little heavier. And then finally, we know where this is going, but with a heavier bodied coffee, we're thinking about maybe heavy cream. So even more weight, even more potentially kind of coating on your palate. And absolutely that can be a very pleasant thing in the case of some kind of expansive full-bodied coffees for sure. So yeah, those are some helpful reference points. So I know that one of the things that for a lot of folks. I mean, I know we get some questions in our cafes about this sometimes, but there's definitely an association, I think, for some folks between full-bodied coffees or heavy-bodied coffees and roast degree. Mm-hmm. So a lot of folks, I think, associate a darker roast or a more developed roast. Not exactly the same thing, but a variety of words are definitely tied to heavier body for folks. So this won't be like the main thing we're wanting to dig in today, but I am curious, what would you say is like the correlation between kind of roasting and the impact of roasting on a coffee and the body that you potentially are going to perceive in the cup?
Yeah. I mean, the sort of just most general, I guess, reference point and easy way to think of it is like the greater the roast degree, the more body there will generally be. I think kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, you're definitely going to get more of those like oils expressed in the cup. You know, you'll see the shiny oily beans. Like those are going to be more accessible to your palate at that roast degree once it's brewed. And you know, I think, and also just a lot of if there are qualities locked in a green coffee that are like tea-like or sweet or something, those lighter bodied qualities, if you take it to a certain roast degree, you'll lose those potentials. And I think, you know, that's worth noting as it does affect body, but probably with a lot of the submissions for Leaderboard, we're more in the light medium.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I mean, certainly here at Passenger, the vast majority of the coffees on our menu are very lightly developed. That's definitely the style of roasting and the sort of cup quality that we're looking for. And even like our more developed coffees, I think compared to like an oily roast that we're talking about, are still very, very light to medium in roast degree. So I think it is important to, like, on one hand, note that a very dark roast, there is going to be a certain type of perceived body that increases because of all of those expressed coffee oils. But it's also important to say that, like, and emphasize that even if all the coffees on the cupping table are roasted or relatively lightly developed, you can still experience quite a wide spectrum of body in terms of the coffees that you're tasting. And that's because there are a lot of other things in addition to roasting style that impact body and mouthfeel. And as you say, my understanding is the coffees submitted for Leaderboard are definitely going to fall in the like medium to light zone. So we wanted to acknowledge the roasting part, but also kind of move forward. We're not going to use roasting as a way to anchor any of our tips for you today. And I would say, like, at that point, we can kind of like start moving in the direction of talking about some things you may want to think about when you're noticing or detecting differing sort of degrees or intensities or weights of body when you're tasting a coffee and you're not entirely sure what it is. As with everything, I don't think that body alone, in many cases, is going to 100% reliably be able to help you consistently and accurately figure out what that coffee is in isolation. As with everything, you're going to want to look at all the great coaching videos on the Leaderboard site and kind of train all the aspects of your sensory skills to be able to kind of sleuth your way using all available information to get to the point where you can really accurately guess what that mystery coffee is. So we don't want you to think that body or mouthfeel is in many cases going to be enough to reliably like know everything you need to know, because there's a lot of tricky coffees out there. But we did want to share some tips that can, in some situations, really help you narrow down your guesses. So let's see. I feel like one of the things we could talk about in this context would be body and what that might tell you about how the coffee was processed.
Yeah. I feel like, if I'm trying to guess a coffee and how it's processed, that's sort of like the first thing that I kind of am looking to narrow out. Just because I think it's usually a pretty safe bet that when a coffee is on the lighter side of body, where it has those tea-like, juicy, syrupy, or maybe not syrupy, tea-like qualities, that it's going to be a washed coffee, washed processed coffee.
So, like, generally speaking, like,
yes,
the vast majority of time, if the coffee is on the light end of the spectrum, in most cases, it's going to be a washed coffee.
Right. Yeah, and then as you move into honey process and natural processed coffees, the body increases a little bit with that. So, it's obviously hard to distinguish when you're getting into that area between honeys and naturals, but definitely seems like there's a correlation of just like the amount of mucilage left in the process, like going forward up to naturals, like creating a heavier body.
And of course, like, you're going to want to combine that sort of either that slightly heavier body or slightly creamy body, or depending on the situation, you're going to want to combine that with the other things that you're picking up when you're tasting it. It could be relatively low acidity. That often also correlates to some of these processing styles. It also, of course, is going to be the flavors that you're getting.
Yes.
So, certain types of fruitiness, or even in some cases slightly winey kind of flavors, those together with that like heavier body that you're detecting are definitely going to point you, in most cases, away from a washed coffee, and you're going to be thinking about a natural process, maybe a honey process, possibly even something else, something more experimental, as well. So,
and sort of like all these categories, it's not a complete catch-all. There are exceptions, because you can get a creamy body, creamy mouthfeel out of a washed coffee, especially if certain varieties are being used in different places, and so yeah. There are exceptions, but generally speaking.
For sure. Let's talk about our next category. So next we want to talk about body and altitude or elevation. So let's say that you're tasting 2 coffees. You don't know what the coffees are, but you are fairly confident based on what you're tasting that they're both washed coffees. If one of those 2 coffees is noticeably lighter in body, in many cases, that's going to imply that it was grown at a higher elevation. I want to be clear and say that is not always the case. You can absolutely be tricked by unique microclimates. So you might have a situation where a farm is actually not at a really high elevation, but maybe it's located very close to a jungle region where you have cooling winds that come in from the jungle and kind of create a unique microclimate that simulates the effect of higher altitude for the coffee trees. That could actually trick you and sort of make you think that it's a higher elevation farm than it actually is. But, so I will say, with that caveat, there is often a correlation between higher altitude and lighter body. What about like body and thinking about guessing what the variety might be? I feel like this is kind of a tricky one.
That's pretty hard to do. I would just say out of the gate, it's like very, very probably rare that you're going to be able to just through body guess a variety. There are definitely indicators, maybe from body,
right?
And that might point you to certain very unique varieties, like Geshas or something. But I'd say in general that's a hard one.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like it's maybe especially hard if you're in the medium kind of zone, right? So if you're tasting a coffee and you feel like it's probably a washed coffee. Let's say the flavors are relatively middle, kind of familiar, like chocolatey, toasted nuts, kind of creamy. Generally speaking, I feel like in many cases, you're going to be thinking about varieties that are commonly grown in Latin America at sort of medium elevations. But there are lots of ways that it could be something else. But generally speaking, like that kind of medium-bodied coffee, if it doesn't have any like really exotic kind of flavor qualities, I'm thinking about Latin America. A fairly good guess could be something like Categorizing. Bourbon, depending on kind of the flavors that you're getting, could certainly be a decent guess. And then I think you also have to think a little bit in the mix about the possibility that it's a hybrid variety. So for anyone watching who's less familiar with hybrids, I think the reason this is relevant is, generally speaking, hybrid varieties are called that because they include somewhere in their genealogical tree Robusta plant genetics in addition to Arabica plant genetics. Robusta, is a completely different species of coffee and is used obviously for very mass-produced instant coffee and very inexpensive coffee. It's generally sort of grown at very low elevations, and Robusta, generally speaking, it traditionally was used in a lot of old school espresso blends, and I think part of the reason was it was pretty cheap and pretty bold in flavor, but also it definitely is known to have relatively high body, pretty heavy body. So working backwards and knowing that some hybrid varieties have Robusta plant genetics, you can see how that translates to potentially a comparatively higher body in the cup for some of those hybrids. And of course, as well, some of those hybrids also tend to be produced at relatively lower elevations. So once again, you're thinking about elevation, thinking that lower elevation often results in heavier body. So you can see how those things can kind of walk hand in hand.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I would say, as far as the sort of maybe other side of the spectrum, with more light-bodied coffees, more tea-like bodied coffees.
Those are a little easier.
They are easier. Yeah, definitely. But I'd be thinking more, about obviously common varieties in Africa. So in Rwanda, Burundi, you might have just Bourbon, or Ethiopian landrace varieties.
For sure.
Whether those be happening in Ethiopia or sometimes not in Ethiopia.
Right. All right, so we had a brief interruption there, but we're gonna kind of restart that section and jump right in.
Yeah. So kind of jumping away from talking about heavier bodied coffees, one thing with varieties related to the lighter bodied coffees. So if you think you have a sort of tea-like, juicier washed coffee, in terms of varieties, you'll probably want to think, there's a few options, but you can think Ethiopian landrace varieties, or other popular East African varieties like Bourbon, often in Rwanda and Burundi, and then even just other high elevation, other sort of popular high elevation varieties that maybe aren't in Africa, but in South America, sometimes you have high grown Cedra, Typica.
Gesha is obviously a classic example as well. And I think partly, certainly when you get a really light-bodied coffee, it's giving you it's narrowing things much more dramatically than when you get a somewhat standard medium-bodied coffee that's relatively chocolatey in flavor profile. If you get that kind of medium-bodied kind of chocolatey coffee, there are just a lot of options in terms of variety. But definitely when you get something very delicate and tea-like, as you say, you can get tricked, but you're thinking East Africa. And like you say, you're kind of thinking it one way or the other. Either it's an East African coffee, it's an Ethiopian landrace variety, or high elevation Bourbon in Rwanda, or it might be what we sometimes refer to as a cultivated indigenous variety. So rather than, even if all coffee kind of originally comes from Ethiopia, there are some varieties that were selected from Ethiopia and taken in a much more direct and recent way to Latin America. So Gesha easily the most famous example. And while a Latin American Gesha it's not going to taste exactly like an Ethiopian coffee, it often is going to exhibit, in addition to that very light body, very characteristic kind of floral flavors, that the combination of those two things makes Gesha like a good choice. But as you say, there are other examples that are kind of similar in terms of how they made their way to Latin America that you would also be thinking about, whether it's Sidra, whether it's Mejorado, whether it's exactly, Pacas as well. While that didn't come direct from Ethiopia, is an example of like a coffee in Honduras that at a high elevation is often going to be pretty tea-like in body as well. So cool. That's really, really helpful. I think that at that point we can kind of transition to our final kind of section that I think body can help you think about when you're trying to guess a mystery coffee, and that is origin. So obviously we just talked about that a little bit, but we'll just kind of go through those three categories that we talked about when we were breaking down ways to differentiate body, and sort of talk relatively briefly about some of the countries of origin that might come to mind. Once again, this isn't a fail-safe list. There are all kinds of different types of coffees with varying intensities or weights of body that definitely apply, but this still is like something to think about. So with heavier bodied coffees, or some of the heaviest bodied coffees that you're going to come across, definitely think about Brazil. A lot of coffee that's produced in Brazil, similar to what we were talking about before, is produced at relatively low elevations. So a lot of times you're talking about Catuai or varieties that are similar, and the combination of that low elevation, and then also in many cases processing. So a lot of Brazilian coffees are naturals or pulped naturals. So the combination of all of those things, and then also just the conditions of production in Brazil, contribute to what is often some of the highest or the heaviest bodied coffees that you're going to come across. Other countries that you might think about that could be a little trickier, but definitely could qualify. It might be India. It might be Indonesia. Some Peruvian coffees are very sort of full or heavy bodied. Maybe Vietnam as well. There are definitely other countries that would be worth considering, but I feel like those are some of the main ones that come in my mind. And then when we're moving into medium-bodied coffees, I mean, it's a very long list. There's a lot of coffees around the world that would kind of fit in this general category. But, I mean, I'm thinking about El Salvador. I definitely would think about Mexico, Guatemala, maybe Peru, maybe Costa Rica, maybe Papua New Guinea. It's a long list. But then moving into light-bodied coffees once again, I think, as we were saying, you're going to think about Ethiopia, you're going to think about Rwanda, Burundi, maybe Panama. Once again, you're thinking Gesha potentially. Some like high elevation Colombian coffees can be like pretty light bodied. And then I also think of Ecuador, both because of the varieties, but also high elevation. Ecuador often produces really beautiful light bodied coffees. And there was one other
one origin that arguably falls outside of these categories, and one of my favorites when you can find a good one. So worth mentioning, Kenya. Kenya kind of stands in its own little category because it can have a bit of a heavier body in that it can be almost like syrupy sweet.
For sure. Caramely.
Right. But it also has that super distinct, the super distinct acidity. I've heard people just call it like Kenyan acidity.
Sure.
It's very phosphoric, kind of sparkly, dancing acidity, which at that level, when the acidity starts to interact and poke out through all the other attributes so much, it kind of complicates one's perception of body, I find.
If anything, I think it might make you think that it's a lighter bodied coffee than it actually is, because the acidity can be so dynamic.
Yeah.
But a lot of Kenyan coffees, it's incredible. Like, I mean, who doesn't love Kenyan coffees? But I think that that very unique combination of actually like pretty heavy body, but also often sparkling acidity. If you haven't already saved that in your sensory memory, just drink a little more Kenyan coffee, pay attention to those two things, and I think once you've kind of filed that away, Kenyan coffees can be very easy to identify because of that very unique and delicious combination. So great. We talked about some of those main categories. We're now going to actually like taste 3 coffees that I put on the table for us that sort of offer some different qualities in terms of body. So these are 3 coffees that are currently on Passenger's menu. And let's just kind of taste them and talk about like how they present to us, specifically focusing on body and mouthfeel. So this one here on the left is coffee number 1. So I mean, this coffee, it's been cooling a little bit. It's at a great temperature right now. I just think it's so chocolatey, and not just in flavor, but also in the sort of expansive body that it offers. It kind of feels like you've just enjoyed a piece of milk chocolate, in that you've got sweetness, but also it's coating. It's kind of creamy. It's definitely for me like a medium to a medium plus body. Kind of full, kind of expansive.
Right. Yeah.
Other thoughts from you?
No, I totally agree. Yeah, just very like, so maybe the primary experience is just like a coating chocolate. Definitely sort of fits into that higher body category for me.
Absolutely. Yeah. So
that's hold up to some milk really well even.
Absolutely. Yeah. Good base for a cappuccino for sure, which would only kind of accentuate that body, right? So this coffee, this is our foundational lot from the Monte Carlos estate in Apaneca, El Salvador. So the variety is Catuai. This is a fully washed coffee. So this being a washed coffee, but also offering that like medium plus kind of creamy, chocolatey mouthfeel. If we didn't know what this was, I definitely would think Latin America for sure. Based on the flavors, based on the like relatively, integrated acidity, but absolutely based on that kind of like nice round kind of coating body that it offers in the cup. Let's talk about coffee number 2 here. Definitely different.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's different in so many ways. I want to talk about the flavors. I think it's like very, very like natural to like want to talk about the flavors, but forcing ourselves to kind of talk about the body and the mouthfeel first. It's not like a dramatic change, but it's definitely for me lighter in body.
For sure.
And also somehow like not as full, not as round, not as expansive. It's definitely closer to juicier tea-like.
Right.
For you as well?
Yeah, it's definitely like a little silkier and just a little more plush. It's like sort of sometimes when you move more towards the higher bodied coffee, there's almost a little bit more of like a grip kind of around your tongue.
Right.
Whereas you move a little lighter and it's just, just a little lighter hand, like in the tactile feel of it. But yeah, super, super silky, tea-like, maybe even like a touch creamy.
Yeah.
But not in the way of that same chocolate coating experience, just like much more elegant.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a softness to the body that kind of gives us a variety of clues.
Yes.
And obviously it's kind of cheating. We know what these coffees are. But with that said, if I'm tasting this blind, I'm noting that it's a relatively light body, and the sort of the way the journey that it takes on your palate kind of starts a little bit juicy in body and kind of ends a little softer, a little creamier.
Right.
And it is relatively light, but also bringing in a little more information it doesn't have really dynamic acidity.
Yeah.
It's like kind of delicate and kind of gentle. But the flavors are not super citrusy or floral.
Right.
You know, the body is light, so if the flavors were more fruit forward or more floral or more citrusy, I might think Ethiopia.
Yeah, definitely.
But since the flavors are a little more cooked fruit, browning sugars, a little bit of black tea maybe, I do think Latin America. So that coupled with that sort of soft body makes me think this is a Gesha from Latin America, which it is.
Yeah, right.
Cheating once again. But this is our El Mirador Gesha, comes from a community that Passenger has another foundational partnership with, the community of producers in Divino Niño, in Suaza, in Huila, Colombia. And I think this is a classic example of, it's a Gesha variety. This is definitely Ethiopian plant genetics, sort of presented as an expression of a very different place of Huila, Colombia. And once again, not at like super high elevations. This is probably maybe around 1,700, 1,800 meters above sea level. So you get some Gesha character, but it's not just like, it's not a jasmine bomb like you might get with an Ethiopian coffee or a Gesha at a higher elevation in Latin America. So I feel like this is a great example of the interplay of like body and like certain flavors to give you a clue that this is a Gesha and it's a Gesha from Latin America, at which point you think Colombia is a good guess. Yeah. There could be some
or
other...
even just it's a Gesha not from Ethiopia.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
So it's, you know, what does that leave?
Exactly.
Fewer. Not as many options. Yeah.
Exactly. Maybe Colombia, maybe Panama,
yeah,
maybe Guatemala, maybe a few places like that. Great. Let's wrap up with this final coffee. Whoa. The fruit just came to the party.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
So this final coffee, man, it has a really unique mouthfeel, a really unique body. I feel like the creaminess that you were describing here is like 50%, and this is like 200%.
Yeah. And it also has a little bit, just kind of like a cocoa-y, you know. That chocolate, it's very... Yeah, it's very cocoa-y chocolate to me, you know, because sometimes I'm often sort of like milk chocolate, dark chocolate. What kind of chocolate am I? You know, I get a lot of cocoa, like, from that.
Yeah, I feel like there's something, and once again, this isn't maybe body specific, but like moving into mouthfeel a little bit, where that cocoa-y quality is like almost slightly dry.
Yes.
You know, whereas like this first coffee from Monte Carlos, it was like milk chocolate fudge, definitely like very creamy. Like here, I feel like there's a creaminess, but also like a slightly drier, but still pleasant kind of chocolate quality.
And, you know, obviously, you're tasting processing as well here, which as we talked about processing contributing to body, like this is a great example. But.
Yeah, absolutely. So I get a ton of, it's impossible to not talk about some of the flavors that we're experiencing as well, which is a lot of fruit, specifically a lot of berries. Yes. A little bit of citrus, maybe a little floral quality as well, but not in combination with like a really tea-like body.
No.
So that combination of creaminess and kind of like maybe even a slightly kind of cocoa powder reminiscent mouthfeel, but with an abundance of fruit. I mean, we're thinking about processing immediately. We're definitely not going to be guessing that this is a washed coffee. And specifically like that explosion of kind of berry flavors with the creamy mouthfeel, 99 times out of 100, this is a natural processed coffee from Ethiopia. Like, could there be a few tricky natural processed coffees from other places that might sneak in there and give you pause? Yes, absolutely. But
I would say too, it's like, again, not always, it's not a catch-all, but I feel like One distinguishing factor I always find between many naturals from Ethiopia versus naturals from other places is, and it's noticeable in this cup and in this coffee, is that there's like a little bit of florals in this. Mm-hmm. Whereas I feel like Central South American naturals, sure, you'll also get a lot of those like red fruit flavors, just super fruited cups, but they lack that little like, you know, that's to me where I'm starting thinking like, okay, this is an Ethiopian natural, like probably, you know.
Absolutely,
yeah.
I think
varieties like just lend that just a little bit in the back.
The
finish,
floral character kind of in the mix with the fruit is a dead giveaway.
Right.
So once again, I mean, in all these cases, like, are we thinking about body entirely in isolation? Absolutely not. We're connecting it with what we're tasting in terms of flavors, in terms of the acidity that we're perceiving, among other factors. But I do feel like this final coffee, which is indeed an Ethiopian natural process called Bukisa from Guji in the south of Ethiopia, is a classic example of sort of bringing together those various pieces of sensory information.
Yeah.
You know, berries, a hint of citrus peel, really lovely floral character in the background, coupled with that like unmistakably kind of creamy, cocoa-y kind of mouthfeel that always kind of is going to point you in the direction of a natural process. Connecting the flavors with the mouthfeel sends us to Ethiopia, and this is indeed kind of an Ethiopian natural process. So I feel like we've really dug into a lot of different aspects of body, and I'm sure there's a lot of other things that we could explore as well. But I think that's definitely enough for this coaching video. Mm-hmm. Thanks so much for those of you that have kind of tuned in and joined us as we talked about body and mouthfeel and tasted these coffees. If you want to learn more about Passenger and kind of our coffees and the projects that we're working on, you can check us out at passengercoffee.com or at passengercoffee on Instagram. In addition to that, we also have a sister company that sources coffee from a lot of the same partnerships and kind of offers coffees roasted in a slightly different style. So if you want to check out our sister company, you can go to necessarycoffee.com or at necessarycoffee on Instagram. Thanks so much for joining us. All the best with this season of Leaderboard, and happy tasting. Cheers.